The Marvel Cinematic Universe is easily the most popular thing in the world in terms of movies. It's grossed billions of dollars at the box office and has been the thing that has made many actors and actresses careers in many aspects. And that says nothing of the characters that have been brought to life the first time because of it. However, as great as it is, and it's great, it does at times take liberties in regards to its characters and how they're interpreted on the big screen. Allow us to show you 10 MCU characters that are nothing like the comics. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Number 10. Quicksilver. Let's start out with an easy one, shall we? When Avengers Age of Ultron was teased via the stinger about Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch, a lot of people were excited, but what came to pass in regards to their characterizations and how their powers worked was curious at best. We'll get to Wanda later, but for now, let's focus on Pietro. First and foremost, in the movies, it was stated that they were created power-wise via the Mind Stone, which later made the Vision. This is a very different contrast to how they were born in the comics. At first, they were the children of Magneto, and thus were mutants. But after some very convoluted machinations by Marvel, due to the movie rights split between them and Fox, they eventually became the byproducts of the High Evolutionary, a being obsessed with evolution and giving people powers. However, the really big divergence with Quicksilver is his powers. In the movies, he was depicted as fast, but not that fast. Bullets not only killed him, he couldn't even get out of their way at times. In the comics, he's depicted as going near light speed and thus way faster than his movie counterpart. Plus, he was a lot mouthier in the comics and is arrogant to a fault. So yeah, really different in the movies. Number 9. Hank Pym. You could argue that Hank Pym is a character that is the character who is the most different in the movies than he is in the comics. Not the least of which was that in the comics, Hank Pym not only founded several Avengers teams, he was a part of them in his prime as both Ant-Man, Giant Man, and more. In fact, many famous and infamous stories featuring the Avengers were around Hank Pym and his Pym particles. Yes, that does include the story about when he was abusive to his wife, Janet Van Dyne, but he did a lot more than that. He was the leader of the mighty Avengers. He created Avengers Academy to help guide the next generation of heroes. He was the one who made Giant Man a thing, and yes, he made Ultron, as well as Jocasta and other robots. Hank Pym is one of the greatest and most conflicted minds in all of Marvel, and while we love Michael Douglas, Hank Pym deserved better in the movies. Number 8. Star-Lord. We won't lie to you. Guardians of the Galaxy, the first one, not the second, is our favorite MCU film. It has everything you could ever want from characters that you likely didn't know about beforehand, which is why you'd be forgiven for not knowing the various differences in story and parentage of Peter Jason Quill. The biggest one is actually in his name. You see, in the movies, his father was a celestial named Ego, the Living Planet, which is a real Marvel character for the record. But in the comics, not so much. He's actually the son of Jason of Spartax, the emperor of the Spartoi Empire. In the now confirmed continuity of Marvel, Jason crash-landed on Earth and was nursed back to health by Meredith Quill, Peter's eventual mom. Jason has to leave though to fight a war and doesn't know he left a son behind. Peter himself has had a long and convoluted history, and let's just say that while he did have daddy issues with Jason, it wasn't to the scale they were shown in the movies. Number 7. Scarlet Witch. The other half of the twins, Scarlet Witch is another character who has been toned down a bit in the MCU, though that might change with the upcoming WandaVision. You see, in the comics, she too is the child of Magneto, until she wasn't, as we noted earlier, and her powers were far beyond the scale of what is shown in her pre-Endgame. She's able to not just move objects and twist minds, she can warp all of reality to her whims. In fact, 3 of the most important acts in all of Marvel history happened because of her. She was the creator of the House of M storyline, where she was tricked into altering reality, where her then father Magneto was in charge of the world. But when she learned the truth about what happened and the lies that were around her, she uttered, "No more mutants," and literally killed or depowered millions of mutants, leaving only a few hundred left on Earth. She did eventually bring them back and has been trying to atone ever since. She's arguably one of the most sympathetic characters in all of comics. It'll be curious to see how WandaVision shows off her powers and personality. Number 6. The Wasp. Another casualty of the Old Man Hank storyline was brought on because of the Ant-Man movie was that of Janet Dan Vine basically being a footnote in MCU history. In the comics, not only was she the original Wasp, she too was a founding member of the Avengers. In fact, she was their only female member until Scarlet Witch came along, among others of course. The Wasp was very much the heart and soul of the team for a long time until Secret Invasion killed her. It didn't take. Janet has been a part of many great stories and teams and even revelations over the years. She was the mentor to many great heroes. Had a kid with the mutant Havoc in a now retconned storyline, in an alternate universe was the mentor to Spider-Gwen. So yeah, she had a lot to offer the MCU. It was said she was relegated to being trapped in the microverse for decades. Number 5. Yondu. Yondu, played in the MCU by Michael Rooker, is easily one of the most fan-beloved characters in the MCU, mainly because of how Rooker played him and how director James Gunn gave him a lot of scene-stealing moments. But here's the thing, if you look at the comics, the MCU and comic versions are basically two different characters outside of blue skin and the mohawk. You see, Yondu in the comics is from the 29th century, so he has no true connection to Peter Quill, and it was he who made the original Guardians of the Galaxy in said 29th century. Yes, you are right in asking that question. Just go with it. Also, Yondu's typical weapon is a bow, not a whistle-controlling arrow. Number 4. The Mandarin. This one is very well known to comic fans. When Iron Man 3 stated that the Mandarin was coming and he would be played by Ben Kingsley, people were confused. Then we actually saw him in action and he was nothing like the comic character. At all, period. It was a lie, and that's all we're going to say on it. Thankfully, Shang-Chi's upcoming movie is going to fix that, we hope. Number 3. Peggy Carter. Full disclosure, we love Peggy Carter in the MCU. Hayley Atwell absolutely crushed that character and made it her own. So much so, she got her own TV series that was canceled way too soon and is getting her own What If episode in the upcoming Disney Plus show of the same name. But if you look at the comics, Peggy isn't anything like this for the most part. For example, she wasn't part of Project Rebirth that gave Steve Rogers his powers. They did meet in World War II, but only after he suited up. She wasn't a government agent until much later in life, and because of the flexible timelines of Marvel Comics, she's basically out of Steve's life, and her granddaughter, then turned niece Sharon, is his love interest. Oh, and Peggy is American in the comics. In this case, we prefer the MCU version. Peggy is a boss there. Number 2, Hawkeye. This one might throw some of you off, but Hawkeye really is different from his comic form in a lot of ways. We see him in the MCU as a die-hard SHIELD agent until he goes Ronin, but in the comics, he was a villain via Black Widow's influence that turned into a hero and has been working hard to prove his worth. Also, his comic costume is way different, and the main 616 version of Clint Barton has a brother, no wife and kids, and is basically a player. Just saying. Number 1, Thanos. Surprised? While Thanos is absolutely epic in the MCU, his character portrayal in terms of his motivation for everything to do with the Infinity Gauntlet is vastly different from the comics. For example, in the comics, he couldn't care less about the balance of the universe. He wants simply and solely to please the entity of death. He's in love with death, and death loves him back, and it was her, not the Eternals or his duty to the universe, that sent him on the quest that led him to snapping off half of the universe out of existence. And despite what the MCU would have you believe, he's not the kind of guy to wait around for things to happen. He always gets it done himself. Oh, and the Black Order? That was a recent creation of the comics via the Infinity storyline. So, what do you think? What do you think of this look at the MCU and the characters from Marvel Comics, who are vastly different depending on which end of the spectrum you're looking through? Were you surprised by how different some of these characters are? Which interpretations do you think are better, the movie versions or the comic versions? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the channel.